At the height of the Cold War, a submarine set out on a mission that was supposed to last only a few days. On board were dozens of trained sailors, state-of-the-art technology for the time, and a simple order: navigate, accomplish the objective, and return home. But it never returned. No distress call was received. No explosion was recorded. No witnesses saw what happened. Within hours, the ocean simply swallowed him. For years, governments had documents, experts created theories, and families continued to wait for answers that never came. Some believed the submarine had been destroyed by a secret collision. Others said it had been the victim of human error. There were even those who swore that a military confrontation, never revealed to the public, was behind the disappearance. But the truth lay nearly 5 kilometers deep, in a place where the pressure is enough to crush steel as if it were paper. Decades later, when most people had already forgotten that tragedy, an expedition decided to search where no one else believed anything existed. What their equipment found at the bottom of the ocean not only solved one of the greatest naval mysteries of the century, but revealed a story far more human than any conspiracy theory. Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't discovering where a submarine disappeared, but understanding why it took us so many years to find it. On the morning that submarine left port, no one imagined they were witnessing its last moment on the surface. The dark hull slowly cut through the water, while the diesel engines could still be heard in the distance. On the dock, sailors waved to family members. Some smiled. Others simply watched in silence, accustomed to the routine of farewells that were part of military life. It was just another mission. At least that's what everyone believed. At that time, the world lived under the constant shadow of the Cold War. The oceans had become a vast, invisible battlefield. Much of what happened beneath the waters never appeared in the newspapers. Submarines from different nations crossed the seas daily, tracking vessels, monitoring enemy bases, and collecting information that could decide the fate of entire countries. Silence was their greatest weapon. Many operations remained secret even to a large part of the military itself. The vessel featured in this story represented a significant technological advancement for its time. Its crew consisted of experienced men, trained to remain completely isolated from the outside world for weeks. Inside that steel cylinder, every space was used to its fullest potential. Narrow corridors connected compartments filled with equipment, valves, cables, and instruments that needed to function in perfect harmony. Beneath the ocean, there were no small flaws. Any mistake could turn into a catastrophe in seconds. The first few days of the mission went smoothly. Scheduled communications were carried out. The systems functioned without problems, and nothing indicated that anything was wrong. Then, suddenly, silence fell. The submarine stopped responding to programmed transmissions. Initially, no one panicked. Submerged communication has always been limited, and minor delays could occur. But hours passed. Then came days, and no message arrived. The authorities launched discreet searches. Planes flew over large areas of the ocean. Specialized ships analyzed possible routes. Listening equipment tried to pick up any metallic signal coming from the depths. The result was always the same: absolutely nothing. It was as if the submarine had simply disappeared from the planet. As the days turned into weeks, hope dwindled. Families received little information. Governments avoided releasing details for reasons of national security. The mystery deepened while the ocean remained completely indifferent. The vast blue expanse concealed any answers beneath miles of icy water, where sunlight never reaches. Over the years, the case became one of the biggest disappearances in naval history. Experts wrote books trying to explain what happened. Former military personnel presented conflicting hypotheses. Engineers analyzed possible mechanical failures. Others believed that the submarine had been the victim of a secret operation never officially admitted. The more time passed, the more difficult it seemed to separate fact from speculation. But the ocean floor holds secrets in a different way. It doesn't just destroy ships and submarines. It also erases traces, preserves objects for decades, and transforms any search attempt into one of the greatest technological challenges humanity has ever faced. Finding a lost vessel thousands of meters deep is like searching for a tiny needle scattered across a completely dark desert. Even so, decades later, a new generation of explorers decided to try again. Much more modern equipment began to investigate regions that were previously impossible to reach. The objective was simple only on paper: to discover that submarine still existed, and, if it did, to finally reveal what had really happened on the day it disappeared without a trace. To understand how a submarine can disappear without leaving virtually any trace, it's necessary to go back to the time when this mission began. It was a period when tensions between the great powers were so high that hundreds of military operations were happening simultaneously without the public even knowing of their existence. Many of them would never be fully revealed, even decades later. Submarines played a crucial strategic role. Unlike large warships, they operated in the shadows. They remained invisible for weeks, cruising international shipping lanes while monitoring enemy movements, testing new equipment, and gathering extremely valuable information. The survival of these vessels depended almost entirely on anonymity. The less they were detected, the better. The routine on board was demanding. Space was extremely limited. Each sailor had specific duties that needed to be performed with absolute precision. Work shifts alternated day and night. Although, inside the submarine, the notion of time was artificial. There was no sunrise, no starry sky, only clocks indicating when to sleep, eat, or resume their post. The commander of that mission was known for his experience. He had already conducted several similar patrols and was perfectly aware of the risks involved. Even so, no one can completely control an environment like the deep ocean. A modern submarine is the result of thousands of components working together: hydraulic pumps, electrical systems, ballast tanks, valves, batteries, engines, navigation instruments, and communication equipment must operate almost flawlessly. A single improbable sequence of small failures is enough to create a situation impossible to control. Before departure, maintenance teams carried out detailed inspections. Documents recorded that all essential systems were operational. Refueling had been completed. Provisions were sufficient for weeks of navigation. Torpedoes and defense equipment were properly stored. In theory, nothing indicated any problem that could compromise the mission. The first few hours went exactly as planned. The submarine submerged, stabilized its operational depth, and began its route. Inside the vessel, the routine continued normally. Operators monitored sonars for any unusual noise. Technicians constantly checked pressure, temperature, and energy consumption. In the command room, minor course corrections were made as the mission progressed. Meanwhile, on the surface, the ocean remained calm. Merchant ships crossed trade routes, unaware that hundreds of meters below, a military vessel advanced in complete silence. This invisibility was precisely the main advantage of submarines, but it also concealed an enormous danger. If something happened, almost no one would notice immediately. In the following days, scheduled communications continued as normal. Nothing seemed different from the numerous previous missions carried out by the same vessel. Official records showed stable operations, with no apparent signs of emergency. It was precisely this apparent normality that would make the disappearance even more intriguing, because accidents often leave clues. Explosions generate acoustic signals. Collisions produce wreckage. Fires provoke desperate cries for help. But in this case, none of that evidence appeared. At a certain point in the mission, the submarine simply stopped responding. No alerts, no interrupted messages, no dramatic final contact. Just an absolute silence that would span decades and transform that vessel into one of the greatest mysteries in maritime history. Initially, no one believed anything was truly wrong. Submarines operate in an environment where communications are naturally limited. Depending on the depth, sea conditions, and the mission itself, it was common for some transmissions to be delayed. Therefore, when the deadline for the first mandatory communication passed without a response, the officers on land remained calm. It was too early to imagine a disaster. A few hours later, another attempt was made. Again, no response. Operators checked equipment, verified frequencies, and repeated standard procedures. The result remained the same. Only the constant noise of the radio filled the communications room. As time went on, the atmosphere began to change. What initially seemed like a routine delay was now being treated as a potential emergency. Senior officers were informed. Command centers began monitoring the situation in real time. Even so, any hasty conclusions were avoided. A submarine was one of the most resilient machines ever built. Admitting its loss without proof was something no one wanted to do. The hours turned into an entire day. Now, there was no simple explanation. The submarine had missed all scheduled communication windows. No updated position had been transmitted. No technical reports had reached the naval bases. It was as if the vessel had disappeared precisely between one contact and the next. The first stage of the response was silent. Before mobilizing large operations, the Navy tried to confirm whether there had been any administrative or technical problems with communications. Experts analyzed radio records, checked atmospheric conditions, and even considered failures in ground-based receiving equipment. Nothing justified the disappearance. Then came the inevitable decision to officially begin a search operation. Ships left their ports at high speed. Maritime patrol planes began to fly over vast areas of the ocean, searching for any unusual signs on the surface. Equipment capable of detecting fuel slicks, wreckage, or lifeboats scanned kilometers upon kilometers of open sea. But there was a huge problem. Nobody knew exactly where to look. The submarine's last known position served only as an initial reference. Since then, ocean currents, changes in route, and the vessel's own movement could mean hundreds of kilometers of difference. Each passing hour exponentially increased the area needed for the search. Experts also turned to hydrophone networks, equipment installed in different regions of the ocean to capture underwater sounds. If an explosion, an implosion, or any event of great intensity had occurred, perhaps some sensor would have recorded the phenomenon. The records were analyzed repeatedly. Some technicians believed they had found small acoustic signals consistent with a structural failure. Others completely disagreed, stating that those noises could have a natural origin or even be caused by distant vessels. No conclusion was definitive. Meanwhile, families were beginning to realize that something serious was happening. Phone calls stopped coming. Official information was scarce. The Navy avoided releasing details for strategic reasons, but the silence spoke louder than any statement. Wives, parents, and children spent days waiting for news that never came. Many continued to believe that the vessel would appear at any moment, surfacing with a simple technical explanation for the delay. That moment never happened. As the weeks passed, the search intensified. New vessels were sent. International experts began to discreetly monitor the case. Maps of the ocean floor were reassessed. Hypotheses were raised daily. Collision with another submarine, catastrophic electrical failure, internal fire, torpedo explosion, human error, or even structural damage caused by the enormous pressure of the depths. No theory could be confirmed. No wreckage. No survivors. No final messages. The ocean remained completely silent. And it was precisely this absolute silence that began to transform a simple accident into one of the greatest mysteries of modern naval history. When an aircraft goes missing, investigators usually have a relatively limited area to begin the search. When a ship sinks, there are often witnesses, distress signals, or debris floating on the surface. But a submarine presents a completely different challenge. It operates hidden underwater. If something happens in the depths, the ocean itself comes to protect its secrets. The commanders of the operation quickly realized they were facing a nearly impossible mission. The estimated area where the submarine might be located measured thousands of square kilometers. It was such a gigantic expanse that, even using several ships and aircraft simultaneously, it would take weeks just to carry out an initial sweep. At the time, the technology available was far from what exists today. Sonars could only map small swathes of seabed at a time. The images were not very detailed, often distorted by underwater mountains, deep canyons, and rock formations that confused the operators. On many occasions, a simple outcrop of rocks looked like a metallic hull. After hours of investigation, it was discovered that it was nothing more than an illusion created by the terrain. Ocean currents also made any calculation difficult. If the submarine had suffered an explosion near the surface, some debris could have been carried hundreds of kilometers in a few days. If it had sunk whole, however, it would have remained virtually motionless on the seabed, hidden in absolute darkness. Meanwhile, intelligence centers began analyzing every imaginable possibility. No hypothesis was ruled out. Some investigators believed that a mechanical failure had caused a sudden loss of depth control. Others argued that an internal explosion could have incapacitated the entire crew before any distress call could be made. Still others suspected a collision with another vessel operating secretly in the same region. Each new theory generated weeks of work. Experts reconstructed the submarine's last known movements, compared meteorological records, analyzed nautical charts, and checked reports from other vessels that had crossed that part of the ocean on the same days. The goal was to find any detail that might have gone unnoticed. But all roads led to the same place: emptiness. Days turned into months. Little by little, the resources allocated to the search began to dwindle. It was impossible to indefinitely maintain dozens of ships patrolling such a vast area without any concrete evidence. Some vessels returned to their bases. Aircraft stopped flying over the region daily. The pace of operations inevitably slowed. For the families, however, time seemed to stand still. Without a body, without identified wreckage, and without a definitive official explanation, many people continued to cling to an almost impossible hope. Some imagined that the submarine might have managed to reach some remote location. Others believed that the crew had been captured during a secret operation. The absence of answers allowed any possibility to seem real. Years passed, and the case began to fade from the headlines. New international crises emerged. Other accidents filled the newspapers. Most people eventually forgot about that submarine loss in the ocean. Only historians, naval engineers, and family members continued searching for answers. However, something important was happening away from the spotlight. Technology was evolving rapidly. New high-resolution sonars, more powerful computers, and submersible vehicles capable of withstanding immense pressure were beginning to completely transform the exploration of the great depths. Places considered inaccessible decades before it could finally be investigated. Unbeknownst to them, humanity was approaching its first real opportunity to find a submarine that the ocean had managed to hide for so long. And when this new search finally began, no one imagined that the discovery would reveal much more than just the location of the vessel. For a long time, locating a submarine lost at great depths was considered virtually impossible. The problem wasn't just finding the vessel. It was being able to spot a relatively small object in an environment larger than any continent, covered by kilometers of water and submerged in complete darkness. Even knowing approximately where to look, the mission could take decades. That's precisely what began to change at the end of the 20th century. The evolution of underwater exploration technology opened doors that previously seemed closed forever. Computers began to process enormous amounts of data in just a few minutes. Sonar produced much more detailed images of the seabed. Remotely operated vehicles began to reach depths where no diver could survive. These devices functioned like mechanical eyes, tethered by long cables or operating autonomously. They descended slowly to regions where the pressure exceeded the atmospheric pressure at the surface hundreds of times. Down there, sunlight never reached. The only illumination came from the reflectors installed on the vehicles themselves. The first expeditions were not certain they would find anything. Many believed that, after so many years, the submarine might be completely covered by sediment or hidden among rock formations. Others argued that the vessel may have fragmented into thousands of pieces scattered across the seabed. Nevertheless, the search began. Oceanographic vessels spent weeks slowly navigating the area considered most likely. Instead of searching visually, as had been done decades before, researchers created extremely detailed digital maps of the ocean floor. Every irregularity was recorded. Every suspicious shadow was analyzed several times before being discarded. Thousands of square kilometers were examined without any results. Some images looked promising. Elongated objects appeared on the sonar maps, resembling the shape of a metallic hull. Whenever this happened, a submersible vehicle was sent to investigate. More often than not, the expectation ended in frustration. Large blocks of rock, ancient underwater landslides, volcanic formations. Everything could fool the equipment when observed only by sonar. But the researchers continued. Experience had taught them that finding a single true detail required hundreds of false leads. It was a patient, almost archaeological task. Each new area mapped eliminated possibilities and brought the team closer to the definitive answer. Then, During one of the deepest scans, an operator noticed something different. It wasn't just a shadow. The proportions seemed artificial. Straight lines appeared where nature normally produced irregular shapes. One side had a long, uniform outline, incompatible with any known geological formation in that region. The team decided to immediately send a remotely operated vehicle. As the equipment began its slow descent of thousands of meters, everyone knew they might be witnessing the discovery they had been waiting for decades. The hours seemed endless. In the control center, engineers could only observe numbers indicating depth, temperature, and pressure. The cameras still showed only dark water, illuminated by small particles that floated slowly in front of the spotlights. With each meter covered, the anticipation grew. Then, suddenly, something began to emerge from the darkness. First, there appeared only a metallic surface covered in rust and marine organisms. Then came perfectly symmetrical curves. Next, details impossible to mistake for any natural formation. At that moment, even before officially identifying the vessel, many researchers already understood that they were looking at a submarine that had remained hidden at the bottom of the ocean for decades. But the real surprise was yet to come, because the position in which he was found began to tell a completely different story from the one everyone had imagined for so many years. The first few minutes of observation were marked by absolute silence inside the research vessel. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. After so many years of failed searches, the experts had learned to distrust even the most convincing evidence. But as the submersible slowly approached the object, any doubt began to disappear. There was a submarine there. Its hull remained relatively well preserved, although decades of exposure to the extreme environment had covered the entire structure with rust, sediment, and marine organisms. Small fish swam peacefully around the vessel, transforming an old piece of military equipment into part of the natural landscape of the ocean floor. The images were striking because they showed something unexpected. The submarine was not completely destroyed. Many experts imagined finding thousands of fragments scattered over a vast area. Instead, much of the vessel remained gathered in a single location. This indicated that the accident likely followed a very different sequence than had been imagined for decades. The researchers then began to document every detail. The cameras slowly scanned the side of the hull, recording structural damage, metal deformations, and points of rupture. No movement was rushed. Every inch could answer questions that had remained unsolved since the disappearance. It soon became evident that certain regions had been subjected to immense forces. Parts of the hull showed inward deformations, a typical implosion pattern caused by the enormous pressure of the depths. In a few seconds, when a submarine exceeds its structural limit, millions of liters of water flood the interior with a violence that is practically impossible to imagine. Even so, the investigators avoided announcing any conclusions. It was necessary to understand the sequence of events. Was the implosion the primary cause of the accident? Or could it have happened only after some other problem that caused a vessel to sink uncontrollably? Answering that question required extremely careful investigation. The experts then began comparing the images obtained from the ocean floor with the submarine's original blueprints, maintenance records, structural calculations, and technical reports produced before the mission. Modern software digitally reconstructed the vessel, allowing them to estimate which compartments had been hit first. At the same time, previously classified documents began to be analyzed by historians and engineers. Some information that had remained secret for years could finally be compared with what the cameras were showing. Little by little, two different stories began to intersect. The first one came from the official archives. The second was written directly on the hull of the submarine. Interestingly, they did not contradict each other. On the contrary, each new detail observed on the seabed reinforced small clues recorded decades earlier, but which had never received due attention. It was then that another discovery caught the team's attention. The submarine was much farther from its last known position than investigators had originally calculated. This meant that, even after the problem began, the crew likely continued trying to control the vessel for some time. Those men hadn't simply disappeared overnight. Everything indicated that they fought until the very last moment to save the submarine and each other. This possibility completely changed how the accident came to be interpreted. The story was no longer just a technological mystery. It also became a story of courage, discipline, and decisions made under unimaginable pressure, both literally and emotionally. But there was still one question that no one could answer with certainty. What started that whole sequence of events? Was it mechanical failure, a fire, an internal explosion, or a seemingly insignificant small problem that, in just a few minutes, triggered a reaction that was impossible to stop? The answer would begin to emerge when researchers reconstructed, minute by minute, the last hours lived by the crew before the ocean claimed the submarine forever. With the submarine finally located and much of its damage documented, investigators began to do what seemed impossible for decades: reconstruct the final moments of the mission. There was no complete recording of what happened on board, nor were there any survivors to tell the story. What remained were technical records, times of the last communications, characteristics of the damage found, and a deep understanding of how a submarine reacts to different types of emergencies. Gradually, a plausible sequence began to emerge. Everything indicates that the initial problem was not an instantaneous catastrophic event. If a devastating explosion had immediately destroyed the vessel, there would likely be a different pattern of wreckage. The state in which the submarine was found suggested another possibility: a progressive emergency in which the crew still had time to act. Inside a submarine, any sign of abnormality triggers a series of rigorously trained procedures. Each sailor knows exactly their role. Some rush to isolate compartments. Others monitor internal pressure, power supply, hydraulic systems, and ballast tanks. In the command room, decisions must be made in seconds, because delays of even a few moments can mean hundreds of additional meters of depth. If a major technical failure did indeed occur, the commander likely ordered an emergency ascent immediately. This procedure involves rapidly expelling water from the ballast tanks using high-pressure compressed air, increasing the vessel's buoyancy. In theory, the submarine begins to return to the surface. But there's a cruel detail. This procedure depends on several systems functioning correctly at the same time. If any of them fail, the submarine may continue sinking, even with the entire crew trying to stop it. As the depth increases, the external pressure grows alarmingly. With each additional dozen meters, tons of force begin to act on every part of the hull. Although these vessels are designed to withstand enormous pressures, every submarine has a structural limit. Exceeding it means entering a region from which there is practically no return. Investigators believe that those men likely realized exactly what was happening. Instruments began to indicate increasing depth. Alarms may have been triggered. Operators were trying to recover the systems. Engineers inspected pumps, valves, and motors. Meanwhile, the commander needed to decide quickly between different alternatives, all of which were extremely risky. The atmosphere inside the submarine had certainly changed completely. Where once there was a relatively tranquil routine, now there was only the constant sound of alarms, orders being transmitted in a firm voice, and dozens of men working simultaneously to save the vessel. Despite the tension, accounts of other similar accidents show that highly trained crews often maintain impressive discipline even in the most desperate situations. No sailor could simply abandon his post. There are no lifeboats at the bottom of the ocean. There is no evacuation. They all depend on the same steel structure. Either the submarine survives, either no one survives. It was precisely this collective spirit that most impressed investigators decades later. The location of the damage and the likely sequence of events indicated that several emergency procedures were correctly initiated. In other words, everything suggests that the crew fought until the very last moment, using all the training they possessed. Unfortunately, there was an opponent who was impossible to negotiate with: the pressure of the ocean. When the submarine exceeded its maximum safe depth, the difference between surviving and disappearing became a matter of seconds. The structure still held out for a short time, but nature always wins when its limits are surpassed. At some point, silently, without any witnesses on the surface, the hull finally gave way. And at that very moment, one of the greatest mysteries in naval history came to rest forever in the depths of the ocean. The discovery of the submarine solved a geographical mystery, but opened up a much deeper investigation. Finding the vessel was only the first step. Now an even greater challenge arose: understanding exactly why a submarine considered extremely safe had disappeared without leaving any warning. Experts in naval engineering, metallurgy, underwater acoustics, and military operations have gathered decades of documents that were previously scattered across different archives. Forgotten reports have been reanalyzed. Technical notes, maintenance records, structural designs, and data collected during the original searches have been compared with images obtained from the ocean floor. For the first time, all the pieces of that enormous puzzle could be studied together. One of the first conclusions was that many popular theories simply didn't make sense. For years, books and television programs suggested secret collisions with enemy submarines, never admitted military attacks, or even unexplained phenomena. However, the state of the vessel did not present evidence consistent with most of these hypotheses. The damage found pointed to a sequence of events much more consistent with an internal accident that rapidly escalated until it exceeded the crew's ability to react. This did not mean that the researchers already knew the exact cause. On the contrary, there were still several technically plausible possibilities. Some engineers believed that a small failure in a crucial system triggered a chain reaction. Others argued that a fire in a particular compartment may have compromised equipment fundamental to controlling the vessel. There were also those who suggested that a seemingly simple problem ended up causing a loss of propulsion at exactly the worst possible moment. Regardless of the hypothesis chosen, they all led to the same conclusion. The disaster was probably not caused by a single monumental error. It was a result of a succession of events that, individually, might have been controllable, but which occurred in a sequence too rapid to allow for any recovery. This finding had a huge impact on naval engineering. Instead of focusing solely on a single defective part, manufacturers began studying how small problems could interact with each other within extremely complex environments. Emergency systems were redesigned. Operational procedures received new verification steps. Training programs began to include much more realistic and varied scenarios. The lost submarine ended up saving lives it would never have known. The lessons learned from that tragedy influenced the designs of subsequent generations. New sensors began to continuously monitor critical equipment. Alarms became more intelligent. Redundancies were added to systems considered essential for maintaining depth control. At the same time, governments began to review transparency policies involving military accidents. For many years, some information remained classified for strategic reasons. This fueled rumors and theories that grew precisely because almost no one had access to facts. Decades later, it became clear that excessive secrecy had also hindered the advancement of technical knowledge. Sharing certain findings could have accelerated important improvements in other fleets around the world. For the families of the crew, however, the investigation had a completely different meaning. They weren't just looking for technical explanations. They wanted to know if their children, parents, husbands, and siblings had done everything possible. The evidence pointed to a reassuring answer. Everything indicated that those men remained at their posts until the end, following protocols to try to save the submarine and protect their comrades. There was no abandonment. There was no uncontrolled panic. There was professionalism in the face of a practically impossible situation. After so many years of uncertainty, this may have been the most important discovery of all, because, although the ocean had hidden the submarine for decades, it could never extinguish the courage of those who remained inside until the very end. When the images of the submarine reached the public, many people saw only an old vessel resting silently on the ocean floor. For engineers, historians, and military personnel, however, those images represented much more than a simple wreck. They were a frozen record of a pivotal moment in the history of submarine navigation. The discovery showed that, even with all the technology available, the ocean remains one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. Humans have learned to fly above the clouds, walked on the moon, and sent probes beyond the solar system. Yet, exploring the Earth's greatest depths remains an extremely difficult task. It was precisely because of this accident that several research programs began to receive much larger investments. Equipment capable of operating at thousands of meters of depth became more sophisticated. Submersible vehicles gained ultra-high-resolution cameras, more precise robotic arms, and sensors capable of identifying small changes in the structure of sunken vessels without the need for direct contact. Naval engineering itself has evolved significantly. Designers have begun to revise structural limits with much more rigorous criteria. New types of steel, modern welding methods, and computerized monitoring systems have become part of construction of subsequent generations of submarines. Many of these advances arose precisely from the analysis of accidents that cost lives but taught lessons impossible to learn solely in laboratories. Crew training has also changed profoundly. Previously, most simulations focused on isolated emergencies. After this and other similar accidents, the exercises began to reproduce simultaneous failures, partial loss of systems, fires combined with electrical problems, and situations where every decision had to be made under enormous psychological pressure. The goal was to prepare the sailors to face exactly what the crew of that submarine likely faced: a rapid sequence of events in which there was no time for hesitation. At the same time, the way governments dealt with disappearances at sea began to change. Although much information remained protected for national security reasons, there was a growing understanding that completely concealing certain accidents also prevented other nations from learning from them. Another important change occurred in the exploration of the oceans. Technologies developed for searching for missing submarines have been used in scientific missions. Researchers have been able to map previously unexplored regions of the seabed, discover new species adapted to absolute darkness, and gain a better understanding of how some of Earth's most isolated ecosystems function. In a way, a tragedy ended up driving discoveries that benefited completely different areas of science. But perhaps the greatest legacy lies not in the technology, it's in my memory. In ceremonies held years later, families were finally able to pay their respects knowing where their loved ones rested. The submarine ceased to be just an unanswered disappearance. It became a silent memorial preserved by the depths of the ocean. No team attempted to remove the vessel. In virtually every part of the world, lost military submarines are considered war graves. They remain exactly where they sank, treated with respect by sailors, researchers, and governments. Whenever an expedition passes near the site, there is an awareness that it is not just a steel machine that lies there. There lies the story of dozens of people who left believing they would return home. Decades of silence have not erased their names. On the contrary, they made the world finally understand the hidden human cost behind one of the most mysterious missions in naval history. Even after the submarine was located and years of technical analysis followed, one reality remained evident. It may never be possible to reconstruct with absolute precision every second of that tragedy. The ocean preserved many answers, but also took others away forever. Researchers were able to establish a highly probable sequence of events. The combination of historical documents, structural studies, acoustic records, and images obtained from the seabed allowed them to eliminate numerous theories that had emerged over the decades. The real story proved to be less spectacular than many conspiracies, but infinitely more impressive. The disappearance did not appear to be the result of a secret battle. There was also no convincing evidence of a deliberate attack. Everything pointed to an extremely rare accident, in which small failures, occurring in the worst possible order, created a situation impossible to reverse. This type of conclusion may seem simple today, but it took decades to reach. At the time of the disappearance, much data remained classified for military reasons. During the Cold War, any information about submarine capabilities, routes, operational depths, or technical limitations was considered strategic. Disclosing these details could benefit rival countries. As a result, the official silence opened the door to speculation. Books were published defending completely different hypotheses. Documentaries suggested clandestine operations. Former military personnel gave contradictory interviews. Each new version seemed to fill the gaps left by the lack of concrete information. It was only when technology made it possible to directly observe the submarine that many of these theories began to lose credibility. The hull didn't lie. The recorded deformations were consistent with known physical forces. The vessel's position corresponded to the expected behavior of a submarine that had progressively lost its ability to control its depth. The structural damage followed patterns studied for decades by naval engineering. For the first time, the facts began to speak louder than speculation. Nevertheless, the researchers themselves demonstrated caution. Science works with evidence, not absolute certainties. There is always a possibility that some important detail will never be discovered. A specific component may have failed first. A small fire may have started a sequence of events. A manufacturing defect, invisible for years, may have played a decisive role. Without fully recovering all the elements of the vessel, some questions will remain without definitive answers. Interestingly, this does not diminish the importance of the discovery. On the contrary, she shows that understanding history doesn't mean answering all the questions, but gathering enough evidence to get closer to the truth in an honest way. The submarine remained hidden for decades not because it was impossible to find, but because humanity did not yet possess the necessary tools to search for it properly. When these tools finally arrived, the ocean revealed a landscape that had remained virtually untouched for an entire generation. It was like opening a time capsule. Every inch of the hull, every metallic deformation, and every detail preserved by the deep waters helped to tell a story interrupted decades earlier. A story written not on paper, but in steel. A story that reminded the world that, however advanced our technology may be, there are still places where nature continues to set all the rules. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson left by that submarine. The oceans don't just hide lost ships. They hold entire chapters of human history, patiently waiting until someone has the knowledge, courage, and technology to find them. Today, the submarine remains exactly where it was found, thousands of meters below the surface, shrouded in perpetual darkness. It remains motionless in a place where time seems to pass differently. There are no waves. There is no wind. There is no sound other than the natural noises of the deep ocean. What was once one of the most sophisticated machines of its time has become a silent part of the underwater landscape. From time to time, new scientific expeditions pass through the region. Remotely operated vehicles slowly descend to the site, illuminating the hull again for a few minutes before disappearing into the darkness. Each visit yields new images, new measurements, and occasionally some detail that helps historians and engineers to better understand the events of that day. But there's a limit that almost everyone agrees to respect. The submarine is not seen merely as a historical object. It is considered a war grave. Within that steel structure remain men who had accepted a profession marked by risk, aware that they might never return if something went wrong. Many left behind wives, young children, elderly parents, and friends who spent decades living with the absence of answers. Finding the vessel did not bring those lives back, but it brought something equally important. It brought closure. For years, countless families lived between hope and uncertainty, without a known location, without definitive confirmation, and without fully understanding what had happened. Their grief remained incomplete. The discovery of the submarine finally offered an answer, painful but true. She showed that those sailors stayed together until the end. It showed that they tried to save the vessel. It showed that they faced one of the most extreme situations imaginable with discipline, courage, and professionalism. This is perhaps the most exciting part of the whole story. When we think of major maritime tragedies, we usually remember the ships, the explosions, or the headlines. We rarely think about the ordinary people who were on board. Men who had dreams, made plans for the future, wrote letters home, and imagined reunited with their families after another mission. The ocean took their voices, but he couldn't erase his history. Decades later, thanks to technological advances and the persistence of researchers who refuse to give up, that submarine has once again become part of humanity's collective memory, not as a simple military accident, but as a symbol of the challenges faced by all who venture into environments where nature still has the final say. The oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and even today we know only a small part of their depths. Somewhere, scattered across the seabed, countless ships, aircraft, and submarines still exist, waiting to be found. Each one holds forgotten stories, interrupted lives, and questions that perhaps one day will be answered. The submarine that disappeared and was found decades later reminds us that history doesn't always end when people stop looking for it. Sometimes it remains hidden in silence, patiently waiting until someone has the necessary determination to continue the search. And perhaps that's precisely what makes this discovery so fascinating. It wasn't just a submarine that reemerged into history. It was a memory of an entire crew. It proved that time can hide the truth, but it can't always bury it forever. Thanks for watching. If this story piqued your curiosity, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Every week we explore real mysteries, surprising discoveries, and historical events that time has almost erased. And until the next video, remember, humanity's greatest secrets aren't always in distant places. Sometimes they remain hidden in the depths of our own planet. There's something curious about the ocean floor. While entire cities change, borders disappear, and generations pass, the depths remain virtually unchanged. An object resting thousands of meters below the surface can remain almost exactly in the same place for decades, as if time has slowed down. That's exactly what happened with that submarine. While the world watched the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, the arrival of humans on space stations, and the impressive advancement in technology, that vessel remained motionless, enveloped in a darkness that no human being could reach. All this time, the ocean silently guarded a story that seemed destined for oblivion. Perhaps that's why discoveries like this one evoke so much emotion. We're not just looking at an old machine. We are looking at a moment in history that has remained frozen for decades. Each mark of corrosion, each warped metal plate, and each preserved compartment tells a part of that crew's last mission. They are silent evidence of people who worked, made difficult decisions, and faced one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Today, most modern submarines have far safer systems than those available at the time. Computers continuously monitor hundreds of parameters. Sensors detect small anomalies before they become critical, and emergency procedures have evolved thanks to lessons learned from accidents like this one. In other words, the sacrifice of that crew helped protect countless others who came after. This is perhaps the most important legacy they left behind. But the ocean still holds many mysteries. Experts estimate that much of the ocean floor remains largely unexplored. New expeditions continue to find missing ships, submerged cities, lost aircraft, and species never before seen by science. It's possible that, at this very moment, other great mysteries lie dormant in the depths, waiting only for technology to reach a level capable of revealing them. And when that happens, new stories will resurface, because history never completely disappears. Sometimes she just waits. Wait decades. It waits for generations. Wait until someone asks the right question and has enough courage to seek the answer. Thank you for joining us on this journey until the end. See you in the next mystery.